sometime.
Justin, are you seeing the Google Doc now?
Yes, I can see the document. I see your beautiful typing.
Yes, don't I have lovely penmanship?
Wonderful choice of font.
You're funny. You're so funny. Is that a greenbelt location you're at in your background?
It is Coyote Valley, which is, right next to San Jose. So very, very beautiful open space.
A heads up, appreciate it.
Yeah, I received a notification, on my phone that it was streaming now. Presumably a lot of other people will get that as well.
And we'll switch to the speaker view in a moment.
Let's see, 27. We'll give people 3 more minutes to trickle in.
Yeah, I'm quite happy. The lunchtime for us out here is a little more difficult than our normal times, but I completely understand as well. I'm working with people on the East Coast all the time, so I generally talk to them early in the morning.
Yeah, for me that is.
Sorry.
Yeah. So I know Gail likes to sleep in, but.
So Sue, I used to manage collectors in Citibank, and I would have them call Californians at 8 o'clock on the dot and say, "Hello, sunshine. You owe us some money." And our collection rate between the hours of 8 and 9 was the best during the day at Citibank. Hello, sunshine.
Don't ever do that to me, Gail. We won't be friends.
Well, you probably weren't delinquent, so I didn't have to worry about you.
Okay, so let's see here. We've got about 33 people on the call right now. We're going to give people 2 more minutes to trickle in. And Julia, can you go ahead and press the and do the mute all routine? Pretty good turnout so far. All right, folks, this is your 60-second warning.
Yeah, to all of our millions of Facebook followers that are watching this on Facebook, last call to hop on Zoom.
Okay, it is 12:05 p.m. Hello, everyone. My name is Richard Mellinger. I am chair of Livable Sunnyvale. I want to welcome everyone here today to hear a talk from Professor Willow Lung-Amam for Asian American History Month on the history of Asian Americans in suburbia. Some notes before we get started. So who is Livable Sunnyvale? Well, we are a local advocacy organization based out of the city of Sunnyvale, California, with a three-pronged mission. Our goal is to fight for housing, transit, and sustainability. And what does that mean? For housing, it means fighting for housing affordability. It means fighting to protect and house our unhoused neighbors. And it means fighting to build more sustainably for infill growth. It means fighting for fair housing. For transit, it means solutions that are climate friendly. It means fighting for more public transportation, for more funding for public transportation, for better service. It also means active transportation and safety. You know, that means sidewalks. It means protected bike lanes. It means making it safe, easy, and enjoyable for people to get around without a car. And then for sustainability, what does sustainability mean? It means that we are in a climate crisis, and the policies that we're fighting for are intended to help make our communities more resilient and more equitable long-term, to fight to undo the legacies of environmental racism, and to fight to protect, you know, our city and the region from the effects of climate change and other forms of pollution. So this event is part of Silicon Valley at Home's Affordable Housing Month series. May is Affordable Housing Month, coordinated by Silicon Valley at Home. There are dozens of events happening across the South Bay on a full range of housing topics and issues. This year's theme is Silicon Valley is Home, and we invite everyone to get engaged with the community of housers to learn about challenges, solutions, and how you can get involved. I am dropping a full calendar of events in chat that you can find there, and I will keep dropping that throughout the meeting for folks who trickle in. And finally, I want to thank our co-sponsors for this talk: Peninsula for Everyone, Leadership Sunnyvale, Catalyze SV, Greenbelt Alliance, the League of Women Voters Cupertino Sunnyvale Chapter, Cupertino for All, South Bay YIMBY, Palo Alto Forward, the Sunnyvale Democratic Club, Firebirds for All, and Mountain View YIMBY. And with that, I would like to hand things over to our moderator, our esteemed Vice Chair, Justin Wang, who will be introducing Professor Willow Lung-Amam. Justin, take it away.
Thanks, Richard. So I'm Justin Wang, Vice Chair for Livable Sunnyvale. And first, before I forget, I just want to make a note to everyone that for your questions, just feel free to throw them into the chat, and we will have a time period at the end of the presentation to do that live Q&A, which will be wonderful. And to get to what all of us are very excited for, I'd love to pass the mic over to esteemed Professor Willow Lung-Amam to do a quick maybe not quick, hopefully as long as she can stay for, a presentation on her book, Trespassers, Asian Americans, and the Battle for Suburbia. So, Professor.
Thank you so much, Justin, and also Julia, who invited me to give this talk today. It is a special honor to be able to do this on AAPI month, to do this on Affordable Housing Month, and to do this in front of an audience that is so intimately familiar and engaged with the topics of this book project. So thank you. It's quite an honor to be here. These issues will feel familiar to many of you. I should say at the outset, though, while we're talking about Affordable Housing Month, this is not particularly a topic about affordable housing. It's perhaps not even a topic about environmental sustainability, but it is a talk about equitable communities and what it means to build and sustain equitable and inclusive communities in which all members are valued and valuable and able to express their identities in landscapes in an equitable way. So I am going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Hopefully we will have generous time for questions at the end. Alrighty, here we go. So my presentation today is based on my larger book project, which was completed and published in 2017. And this came out of my dissertation work that I was doing while a student at UC Berkeley. And as a student at UC Berkeley in the Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning program, and someone deeply interested in questions about equitable and diverse communities, one of the things that I was really interested in is getting to know my new home called the Bay Area and the communities that lived in the Bay Area. So this book project really came out for me of a lot of questions that I had when getting to know my own Bay Area home, and particularly when traveling to the Silicon Valley, which I should have known about, having been a graduate of Stanford University. But I didn't really know many of the communities that make up Silicon Valley during the 4 years that I spent there as an undergraduate. But as a graduate student, I really did come to know and become fascinated by some of the communities that are so diverse and so have such fascinating cultures and communities in the Valley. And I really wanted to explore and answer some questions for myself about who these communities were and what was some of the politics that underlied some of these communities. And as someone who is an urban planner by trade and studies built environments, I was particularly interested in the ways in which these diverse expressions and politics played themselves out in debates over the changing built environment that happened alongside immigration and the Valley. And so my talk today will focus on the one community that I spent my time in for the book project, which is Fremont, California, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. But to lay the context for thinking about changes in the Valley and the politics of development therein, I think it's important to note that this is a suburban community, and like many suburban communities has been one that has been vastly changed over the last several decades. When people tend to think about suburbia, they tend to think about white middle-class communities, which were constructed largely in the post-war period through public policy that excluded non-whites from suburban environments, but also a number of private practices and other practices that made these communities seemingly natural communities, but were very much constructed and subsidized through public policies. We have seen the dismantling of many of those policies over the last several decades, and as a consequence, the blooming of a much more diverse suburban population. So this is showing you that by all racial and ethnic groups, how the populations of those that are now living in suburbia. We are a suburban nation, and every racial and ethnic group is predominantly suburban rather than urban, which defies a lot of our stereotypes and a lot of our imaginations of where these groups live. But particularly for Asian Americans, they are amongst the highest groups that now occupy suburban populations, alongside immigrants, which, these are crossover groups in a lot of cases, which are also predominantly suburban at the rates that almost are similar to non-Hispanic whites today. And nowhere is this more true than in high-tech environments like Silicon Valley. So this is showing where Asian Americans are going. On the left, you see a high-tech immigrant entrepreneurship map by metropolitan statistical area. And then on the left, you see for Chinese and foreign-born where their largest percentage of populations are. And these are not so dissimilar maps. And so what it's showing you is that the trends in suburbanization and immigration, especially for Asian Americans and those who have been attracted to, because of public policy, again, high-tech visas, which have allowed more immigration from these particular countries that have skills that are in high demand, are also attracting more immigrants to particular communities like Silicon Valley. So Here you see our hotspot, which is the kind of center of where you all are sitting right now. And in the larger book project, I look at how Asian Americans have really transformed the landscape of the Valley vis-a-vis this one community of Fremont, California, how they've built home and built community in this place by reshaping and repurposing their given landscapes. And I do this in several ways, through the schools, through Asian malls, and through the building of these so-called McMansions, which I'll speak mostly about today. And so what kind of social and political conflicts have been fought over these changes that Asian Americans have brought to the landscape? And how have these conflicts affected the ways in which Asian Americans have been integrated into their community and the benefits that suburbia once seemed to promise to more middle-class white suburbanites? Those are the questions that really drove my research in this area. And the title of my book, Trespassers, is meant to be a bit of an intrigue, and that's why there's a question mark at the end, because trespassers implies the notion of someone making an unwarranted and uninvited incursion into a landscape. And I think that while when many of us think about Asian white integration, and particularly into middle or upper middle income suburban communities like Fremont, we see it as a sort of embodiment of the American dream, this diverse landscape where everybody gets along and there's no underlying tensions in this place. And what I wanted to show in this book is that even in these sort of pinnacles of middle-class diversity, there are underlying tensions and the ways in which Asian Americans and Asian immigrants in particular are marginalized, even in these seemingly diverse and inclusive places. And so the primary focus of the book is sort of thinking about landscapes of difference. And what I mean by this are the places that reflect a kind of different version and vision of the suburban American dream that was not the sort of middle class and exclusive version that really made up the post-war suburbs, and how Asian Americans have adapted the landscapes to their own needs, desires, and uses that have mixed and remixed some of the traditional suburban forms of American life and social and community traditions. But how these changes, these landscapes of difference, have also been really embattled in the focus of city planning and many policy efforts that have often been aimed at muting or managing difference in the landscapes. And so I'm talking about suburban inequality, not just as exclusion from the landscapes, as in the post-war suburbs when non-white members were not able to move into these communities, but as more subtle expressions of privilege and power in the landscapes, and how dominant norms and standards that govern our landscapes really limit some expressions of difference, and at the same time uphold homogeneity, conformity, order, stability as critical tenets of their forms. And these, in turn, uphold middle-class whites as the standard bearer in suburban design and planning. So as an underlying theory here, I pick up on the notion of the racialization of space. Richard Schein, who is a geographer, once said that all American landscapes are racialized and can be and should be read through the lens of race. So what does that mean, and how does that apply to the ways in which we think about suburban landscapes. Well, here on the left, I have a picture of the post-war suburb, the traditional white middle-class family standing in front of a Levittown home. These homes, while underlined with public policy that excluded non-whites from the landscape, that excluded them from communities, became a sort of pinnacle of our imaginations of the American dream during that period, but was an exclusive dream underlied by the systematic exclusion of non-whites through redlining, collective acts of violence, and various ongoing forms of exclusion that really obscured the kind of work that went into maintaining these privileged places. And so while we tend to think about these places as valued and valuable and reflective of the fruits of hard work that white Americans went into being able to buy their suburban homes, we really obscure the kind of privilege and power that went into the making of these landscapes. And likewise, I show on the right early pictures from Chinatown of the 19th century and Chinatown of today, and the ways in which these images also reflect a kind of racialization of the landscape. So on the upper portion, you see depictions of Chinatown in the 19th century and how they tended to be depicted as these seedy, dark havens of criminal activity, and Asian Americans as the very source of the blight and contagion that underlied these places. What is not depicted is the kind of racialized zoning and the lack of investment that went into and was in fact drawn out of these communities that helped to make them much less financially stable and much more much more blighted communities. And so the kinds of stereotypes that we apply to places are often translated to the people that are seen to occupy them. And on the bottom, the kind of Chinatown landscape that we're familiar with today that shows a kind of exotified image of Asian Americans and this presumed ability to never be able to integrate into the American landscape, right? This notion of the forever foreigner and the ways in which it's presented inside the landscape is another form of racialization that happens. So I'm going to be exploring some of these themes in my talk today. I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, my sort of entry point into sort of thinking about these questions inside of the Silicon Valley. I did, when I first got to Berkeley, what I would call a little shoe leather research, which is that I started going around and thinking about the communities in which were surrounding me and trying to learn from the landscape about some of the questions about racialization and exclusion and inclusion that I was interested in. To do so, I pulled out GIS maps of Bay Area communities and tried to learn about the social and demographic composition of those communities. I visited downtown San Francisco, I visited Oakland, I visited many far out communities that I had never been to before, like Richmond and elsewhere in the Valley. Just try to understand sort of the demographic compositions, both by race, by class, by foreign-born status, and what was drawing different groups to different areas and the kind of tensions that were emerging in those communities. One place that I didn't imagine spending that much time in, but that I found very intriguing when I went there was Fremont. And this picture from the Little Cobble Market is part of what began to intrigue me about this landscape. If any of you have been to Fremont, you may know that this market stands in the middle of the Centerville neighborhood of Fremont, which is has the largest Afghani population outside of Afghanistan. And yet you can also see in this picture that the little cobble market serves not only Afghanis, but also Indians and Pakistanis and Fijians in the landscape. And so I was intrigued by the kind of inclusion that this market might suggest. I was also intrigued by the tensions that might not be as readable in the landscape. And so I began hanging out in places like the little cobble market and other malls, and sitting in the back eventually of some of the classes at some of the Fremont schools, and ended up in the process of my research talking to about 130 people, students, parents, principals, community leaders, school board members, the mayor, the city council members, and doing a lot of archival research to kind of try to understand the kind of tensions that surrounded these kind of developments that Asian Americans had introduced to the landscape of the valley. So here I give you just a few more demographic details just of the valley itself to show you the ways in which this community has changed so much in the past several decades. So the map on the left is the map of Silicon Valley, and you guys can probably spend the rest of the day talking about whether I've correctly depicted the communities that make up Silicon Valley, but I've just chosen one map and looked at it in 1980 and then looked at it in 2010. And what you see is over a 30-year period, and this is showing Asian Americans by city in those Silicon Valley cities. And what you see is that in 1980, you had almost all communities in the Silicon Valley with less than 10% Asian American population. And by 2010, you have 3 majority Asian American cities: Fremont, Union City, Cupertino, Milpitas, actually more than 3, 5 majority Asian American cities. So you can see this vast transformation of the valley in just a very short period of time. Now we can talk about the immigration laws that allowed this. Those were some that excluded non-Europeans from immigration prior to 1965. And then the opening up of those immigration laws post 1970, but also new policies to try to attract more high-tech and highly skilled immigrants to the valley, which has particularly impacted the migration of Chinese, Taiwanese, and Indian migrants to many of these more middle-class majority Asian American cities. Sorry, my forward button stopped moving for a second. So here I just wanted to show where Fremont is for those of you who might not be familiar. And I wanted to give you a sense of how quickly the demographic changes in Fremont has been reshaped between 1960 and 2010. So on this top line, you'll see white in Fremont. In 1960, they were 98% of the population. Again, in part because of many of the exclusive laws that prevented non-whites from moving into the community. In 2010, they are 33% of the population. The Asian American population, meanwhile, went from 2% to now more than 50% of the population. And in the meantime, the foreign-born population has gone from 5% to 43%. And while many people tend to associate the migration of non-whites into a community with the lessening of home values and income, this is definitely not true for many of these middle-class Asian American suburbs whose median income, as you well know, has exploded over the last several decades. And so we've gone from 25,000 in 1980 to 87,000 and probably much further, much more today. So first I want to talk a little bit about the schools. I'm going to talk a little bit about the malls, and then we're going to spend most of our time talking about these so-called McMansions. So the larger book project has a concentration on schools, in part because when I talk to anybody in Fremont about where some of the greatest politics around Asian immigration have happened, and where the biggest changes to the landscape are most notable, it oftentimes centers around the migration to neighborhoods predominantly for the schools. And so here is a map of the community of Fremont. And what you see is Asian Americans by block group, so where Asian Americans are most concentrated. And also you see these little flags here, which indicate where some of the top performing schools are in the community. And what you see is that there is a correspondence between the two, because Asian Americans, like many immigrants, when they move to a new community, one of the most important things that drive their migration patterns more broadly is education for the next generation. So many people that I talk to, many new Asian immigrants, when I ask them why they settled in Silicon Valley, it was to give opportunities to their children. And when I asked them what attracted them particularly to communities like Fremont, it was to give opportunities to their children. And what opportunity means for many of these families is a good education. And so it is therefore not surprising then that people would move into the areas that had the most high performing schools. And in Fremont, that is true. And in fact, many people will move from this neighborhood, which has good elementary schools, into what is outlined in blue here, the Mission High attendance boundary for middle and high school, because they have some of the top performing schools in the state of California. And what I look at in this chapter is the ways in which Asian Americans have transformed the kind of politics of education within the schools. And so I'm thinking here about the kind of priorities that Asian American parents have pushed the school in terms of changing the curriculum, but also the pushback that many established white middle-class parents have pushed back in various ways about changes in the curriculum and the culture of the school. So here I'm showing you a depiction from a Mission High school newspaper that is depicting the kind of stress and rigor of the school that's associated with a lot of times stereotypes about Asian American parents, and particularly the so-called notion of the tiger mom, right? Parents who are only concerned with grades, students who are only concerned with grades, and oftentimes push higher AP standards and curriculum for their children. And these stereotypes are certainly at play in Mission San Jose High. And when I talk to Asian American students and parents, they oftentimes will poke fun at themselves around the kind of culture of the school. And in fact, in Mission San Jose High, the cheerleaders even sometimes poke fun of themselves with a cheer that goes something like this. Cosine sine, 3.1 for 159, 240s on SATs. And yes, we all take 5 APs. And so it's this kind of way of embracing, in some ways, the kind of stereotypes around Asian American performance in the schools, but also a way of making space, in a sense, for people who fall outside of these bounds. And there were certainly a number of students that fell outside of these bounds that I spent a lot of time talking to in the schools. But what I spend the majority of my time talking about is how these stereotypes that are often associated with Asian American parents and students drive changes in the neighborhood. So here I'm talking to a parent, a parent and a teacher at Mission High, and talking about the conversations that she's had with white parents and students about why they've decided to take their kids out of Mission San Jose High. So Mission, while I've shown you the kind of changes in the demographics of across Fremont, the changes at Mission San Jose High, even within the last 3 years, have gone from basically a white majority school to almost a completely Asian American school, which implies that the neighborhood is also changing, right? And it's not just changing because people are aging out and they don't have kids in the schools anymore, but it's changing because people are actively making the decision to move their kids out of these schools and put them into other schools in which they might be more competitive, or where the culture might be more in line with the kind of values that they see for their children. So here she's talking about why what parents are telling her, that you don't honor the needs of white students, that you're shutting down all the electives, the wood shop shut down, the kids can't sign up for that anymore. There's no elective that are appropriate for white students. They're all advanced placement this, advanced placement that. This is not a traditional or regular high school that's amenable to a regular kid. And what I'm emphasizing here is the ways in which white privilege and this kind of notion of the standard bearer of what is normal and what is regular, and what is appropriate for a high school curriculum, and what is appropriate to be offered at the school, and the ways in which white parents are positioning their children, because they're able to move to other communities where their kids are able to excel at sports or in theater or in non-AP classes and still maybe get into a UC Berkeley, but are also denigrating and marginalizing those who are making other choices. I want to say something briefly about the Asian Mall as well. You may be familiar with this term, or these kind of strip malls that are predominantly serving diverse Asian American groups, oftentimes that are anchored by an Asian grocery store, have several restaurants and Asian serving retail inside of them. These are places that are the center of suburban social and cultural life in Silicon Valley. I call them kind of the suburban main streets for many Asian Americans who have moved to the suburbs. And I talk about the ways in which these places are really vibrant cultural spaces in ways that really defy some of our notions about the suburban mall and the various kinds of uses and users that make up these spaces. But I also talk in the book about the ways in which these have been the center of various kinds of backlash against Asian Americans and their place in the landscape. And so I talk about them as kind of problem spaces. So when I talk to many white established residents about these malls, they didn't talk about them as vibrant cultural spaces or suburban main streets. They talked about these kind of spaces as kind of taking over the retail landscape, places that promoted segregation and were unwelcoming to non-Asians. When I talked to city officials and planners, they often complained about the vast amounts of Asian language signage, the ways in which there was an unhealthy clustering of businesses, that these were trashy and chaotic places, and oftentimes were the center of new attempts to try to regulate these places. And so here I'm showing you in Fremont, a place called Fremont Times Square, which was the center of a new series of regulations that the city adopted around condo retail. Condo retail means that each owner of each of the different spaces in a mall can own rather than rent their own spaces. And this is a unique form to the Asian mall. It actually promotes entrepreneurship and commercial ownership, which is something that helps new immigrants get a real footing in a new place. But these condo retail regulations that the city of Fremont adopted really changed the ways in which the mall was able to operate, and as I say in the chapter, really mainstreamed the Asian mall. So it addressed things like the size of units, which in the Asian mall tend to be smaller, oftentimes subdivided to allow multiple tenants into one space. It addressed things like visibility on the windows, the idea that these places were too trashy and chaotic, and that there was just too much signage. It installed a property owners association that had a 51% stake in the property that allowed the city to better be able to redevelop the property and not have to deal with its multiple owners in the process, and adopted new covenants, codes, and restrictions that regarding maintenance, aesthetics, and signage that allowed the condo association to do more regulation of the space, and allowed the city to, through conditional use permitting, to actually have more of a say in terms of this, what they called unhealthy clustering of businesses, particularly this large amount of restaurants that you typically see in Asian malls. And therefore, through the parking regulations, we're able to say we need a more sort of normal distribution of different kinds of businesses in this particular mall, and in all Asian malls. And so while I'm arguing here that on the one hand, the city has sort of seen Asian malls as sort of unhealthy, as unwelcoming, as not fitting the mainstream, and tried to adopt regulations that have driven it more towards the mainstream, the kind of Asian malls that they have embraced have been more of the exotic variety, those that sort of fit our image of Chinatowns of today, the kind of exotification and forever foreigner stereotypes that I talked about in the beginning. This is a mall, a proposed mall in Fremont that actually never happened, but was proposed by an Asian developer in San Jose that had built various Asian shopping malls in that environment. But when he came to Fremont, he was kind of well aware of the reputation of Fremont as being somewhat unfriendly to this kind of development. So said to Fremont planners and the city council, I'm not going to do a traditional Asian mall. I'm going to do a mall that's going to be inclusive of everybody, sort of defying the stereotype that these places are unwelcoming to non-Asians, right? And so what he proposed was essentially the Mall of America in the middle of Suburbia, a place that made space for everyone. So in this mall, there is a little Africa, there is a little Europe, there is a little Australia, there is a little, a space for everyone in this shopping mall. And this plan, as opposed to the various kinds of more organic Asian malls that you see in Fremont, was very much embraced by the city council, passed through permitting with almost no problems, and actually really fast track through the Fremont City Council. But faced financial troubles during the recession, and the developer ended up filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and never building out the entire mall. And upon reorganization, after filing Chapter 11 bankruptcy, said, you know what, in order to do what is financially feasible, we're just going to do one part of the mall, the Asian mall. Because, of course, in Fremont, you don't have that many Africans, you don't have all these different people that the developer was trying to appeal to try to say to the city council that we're not that kind of mall, right? And so what exists today is just this latter part right here, which is the Asian mall portion as proposed. Now I want to talk about these so-called McMansions. The title of this chapter is That Monster House is My Home. And I use this term monster house because that's what many people refer to when they talk about these large and implying too large homes that are often built in the Silicon Valley, and oftentimes built by new immigrants. And so the notion of the monster house is implying that it doesn't fit, that it's too large, it's too big, and that it's not necessarily welcome in a neighborhood, right? It's unfitting, it's outside of the norm. Here is a neighborhood that sits right next to Mission San Jose High in Fremont. And this is a neighborhood that has been the center of a lot of the controversies over the so-called building of these McMansions in the city of Fremont. This is showing one of or two of the ranch style homes that were typical of that neighborhood, here and here, next to two larger homes that have been torn down and replaced. Both of these built by Asian American families in this particular neighborhood. So you can see the size and scale and design is quite different. And this has been the center of a lot of controversy over the rebuilding of these homes. This is the family that lives in one of those homes that I told you about. This is Dan and his wife. I spent a lot of time both talking to them and inside of their home, talking to them about their stories and why they decided to tear down what was a ranch style home, which you see them standing in front of on the left, to rebuild this home in this very same spot. So that's the very same lot that you're looking at on the left and the right. And I asked Dan why it was that he had made this decision for his family. He talked about how he and his wife had moved to the Silicon Valley in the 1980s, had struggled a bit to start his own company, had rented for a long time prior to building what was a successful business. And when he built his business and he found some success, his first priority was to move into a neighborhood that offered his kids an opportunity for a better education. And they picked this neighborhood called Mission Ranch because it sat right next to Mission San Jose High School, which, as we've talked about, is some of the best schools in the nation. He wanted to give his daughters the opportunities that he never had to get a better education. So they moved into this house on the left in the 1980s. And I asked, did he like the home? He said, we hated it from the day we moved in. His wife hated the shag carpeting that was in the house. They didn't have enough bedrooms for their daughters. They had to sleep in one room. And they always dreamed of being able to rebuild their house, not only for themselves, but also for their daughters, to be able to have the opportunity to not only send their kids to Mission San Jose High School, but also eventually to send their grandchildren on to Mission San Jose High School. So at the first chance that Dan, after being able to save up some money, was able to do is he actually, and according to the city regulations, was allowed to basically tear down, with one wall still standing, the old house and build what was essentially Dan's dream home. And that's what you see represented on the right. So in this house, Dan has picked out everything from a custom chandelier that he had imported from Hong Kong and that he and his daughters hand pieced together, to this kind of picture window that you see in the front, which is where Dan places his Christmas tree every year. He and his wife complained that there was never a good place to put the Christmas tree in their former home. And so while many people kind of stereotype these homes as kind of generic homes, that they're all cookie cutter, they're oftentimes called pink elephants in the valley because they're seen as these really big, ostentatious homes. This really did actually reflect Dan's values, his beliefs, and his American dream. He also, importantly, in this home, has built 2 master bedrooms, one for he and his wife on the upper floor, and another for his daughters on the lower floor, so that he so that they eventually can move back into the home and be able to send their kids directly across the street to some of the best schools in the nation. So to Dan, this is a multi-generational home. This is a home that reflects the kind of values that he has for his home. And while many people would complain that this is perhaps not environmentally sustainable, I can see in the back of your minds that's being said. Dan talks about how, these large lawns and the other homes in the neighborhood that require watering are actually less sustainable than his house. When Dan built this house, he put 2 layers of insulation in every wall. He got low flush toilets. He says him and his wife don't even flush the toilets every day. He got efficient heating and air systems. So in every way that Dan was able to talk about the neighborhood, he really defied many of the kind of complaints that I was hearing from Dan's neighbors about these homes. And these were largely white middle-class residents who talked about how these homes didn't reflect and retain the existing neighborhood character, how these homes didn't reflect the value of the small single-family home, how these preserving the historic and unique aspects of these neighborhoods were really important, how the aesthetics of these homes were not to their liking, how they didn't respect the kind of privacy of residents' homes, and they didn't respect the environmental sustainability and the value of the great outdoors, and how they divided the neighborhood. But to every one of those critiques, Dan and his wife shared a reason why that was not the same as the way they saw their home, their neighborhood, and the value of their neighborhood. Oops. And here I'll just give you a little bit of a contrast to one of the neighbors that actually sits along Dan's street and actually filed a complaint with the city about Dan rebuilding his home. And they, in contrast to Dan, were a white couple that had grown up in California in similar kinds of exclusive suburban environments, had grown up in ranch style homes, had very fond memories of the kind of block parties and 4th of July cookouts that used to happen on their streets, and associated these homes with that kind of sense of community and neighborliness that they grew up around, and associated the McMansion, or these so-called monster homes, with a kind of shutting of the doors and the kind of lack of friendliness that Asian Americans have brought into this neighborhood. They also associated it with a real sense that their values didn't matter. When we did their interview, we sat outside in their yard, and they talked about how much time they spend kind of cultivating this beautiful yard, and how disruptive it would be if someone built a McMansion next door that could look into their backyard, and that how the new neighbors moving in didn't appreciate the value of these homes or the neighborhood as it was constructed. This was not only an internal debate among residents of the neighborhood, but actually went all the way up to the city council, who adopted new regulations for the Mission Ranch neighborhood and for the Glenmore Garden neighborhood, another neighborhood where these debates were hot in the city at the time. These are two of the early advertisements for those two neighborhoods that's talking about these addresses of distinction, these gracious living communities that actually were underlined, as I've said many times now, with exclusive regulations that did not allow non-whites to be able to live in these. So these were some of the more exclusive neighborhoods in Fremont that residents were alongside trying to protect these neighborhoods from change, were also at the time happening when large amounts of Asian Americans were beginning to buy homes in these neighborhoods. This is what the city ended up doing. They ended up adopting regulations around design guidelines for the Mission Ranch and Glenmore Gardens neighborhood, and a new set of development standards. The design guidelines told planners that if you're reviewing changes to the permitting in these neighborhoods, these are the things that you should encourage, and these are the things that you should avoid. And these are actually pictures from their design guidelines. Now you see the picture on the left looks a lot like a McMansion. The picture on the right looks a lot like a traditional ranch style home. So what essentially the city was saying is that if somebody's trying to rebuild in this house, what you want to do in your permitting is try to encourage these large bay windows, trying to encourage these shingle roofs, and trying to encourage the one style homes. And very explicitly, by naming the red tile roofs that you're probably quite familiar with in Silicon Valley, these oval-esque windows, these large porches and so forth, and the gating around them is discouraging homes from being approved if they are including these design elements. And likewise, they changed the development standards in the neighborhood to avoid the kind of large homes that you saw pictured before, and which was Dan's home. So under the old regulations that Dan rebuilt his homes under for the Mission Ranch neighborhood, essentially you could get about 6,900 square foot on a lot such as this. But under the new development standards that were adopted by the city council, they're essentially, if you want to build a 2-story home on that very same lot, you're only able to get about 3,000 square foot. So they more than cut in half the allowable square foot that was able to be built on the property. And importantly, mostly restricted the addition of a 2nd-story home, which had been quite common actually in that neighborhood prior to new immigrants beginning to move in and build in the so-called style of the McMansion. Many people, like in Levittown and other places, have added on to their homes over time and added second stories and additions onto their home. But now it became the centerpiece of new regulations that actually only allowed what Dan called a submarine house, right? This little addition onto the top of the house that didn't actually make room for the kind of house that Dan wanted, which was a 2-suite house that allowed him and his wife to live upstairs while him and his daughters and his grandchildren lived downstairs. So they essentially banned the kind of style of the multi-generational house that Dan and his wife and many other immigrants in the Silicon Valley wanted. And I argue here that it was not just the desires of, the fact that the established white residents showed out in larger and larger numbers to city councils to protest against these homes being built in their neighborhoods. It was not just that Dan and his Asian immigrant neighbors didn't really know how to show up at city council and had never participated in such meetings before and didn't know and were not organized around the sort of 5 or 10 minutes that you get at a city council meeting to be able to present your arguments. And his white neighbors were quite organized in that process. And so we're therefore able to present their arguments in what seemed like much more logical and normal kind of ways, which the city council really did respond well to. But it was also because many of the city council members themselves were established white residents of the neighborhood and really took these homes as a personal affront to the kind of values that they saw as normal and fitting in a suburban neighborhood like Mission Ranch. So here's the mayor, Bob Wasserman at the time, who has since passed, talking about why he voted to adopt these regulations in the Mission Ranch neighborhood. And he says, people were coming in and just building these horrible looking things that virtually ruined the neighborhood. It was very sympathetic. I'm usually pretty liberal on what I would allow to be built, but it was just terrible what they were doing to these neighborhoods architecturally and even culturally. And so you kind of see the kind of ways in which what is considered normal, acceptable, and fitting in these neighborhoods really prioritize the kind of standards and values and norms of the white middle class and often marginalize those of different Asian and other immigrant groups. And in closing here, I'm pulling up a picture of Levittown, which I referred to before. This is sort of the classic post-war suburban neighborhood that was built out with racial covenants that prevented non-whites from living in this neighborhood, and really was the poster child of the period of mass suburban migration amongst the white working middle class, and the ideas that really built up this idea of the suburban American dream, and culturally that was underlined with a lot of cultural homogeneous ideas about family and community. But what you see in 2011 is that Levittown is vastly changed. The footprint on the left is what the home footprints used to look like in Levittown, and on the right is what they look like today, showing how over time people built onto their homes and customized them in ways that really reflected their identities, their different family structure, the fact that we don't all live in a traditional American family with a working male and a wife that stays at home, but many are single parents, many LGBTQ couples live in Levittowns today, many immigrants, many non-white people, many people that have more children or no children at all. And they've really customized these homes that were really just starter homes to embed a different identity and different values and different norms in their homes. And what I am arguing is that the same should be true for different immigrant communities. If we are going to make more diverse and inclusive communities, we should also be thinking about the ways in which our planning and design regulations reflect that value of inclusion and diversity. And so I'm going to end here with a picture from my own neighborhood. It's just here in Washington, D.C. And this is I don't live technically in a suburb. I technically live inside the boundaries of Washington, D.C., but the neighborhood is really suburban. And when I first got to the neighborhood, I took a walk through my neighborhood, and the house that stuck out to me the most is this home here, which has, you can see the Jamaican flag, but perhaps what you can't see is the concrete model of the island of Jamaica that is built into the landscape here in this person's front yard. And this is complete with a donkey and different islands or different mountains and geographies that really represent Ocho Rios and Negril and all the different landscapes of the island of Jamaica. And at first I thought, why would he do this, right? Why would somebody not only create a mosquito haven, but tear up their entire front yard in order to do this? And many of my neighbors similarly complained. But I think it's really important to think about this as the kind of expressions of difference that we're actually trying to facilitate and foster in suburban and urban environments. And so I call this a right to suburbia, or the right of others to kind of craft suburban landscapes that reflect their different versions of an American dream, right? The right to express non-normative ideas, needs, and desires in the landscape, to challenge this idea of what good suburban form looks like, to embrace a kind of messiness and conflict in the landscape, to design actually for change, and to open up planning and decision-making processes to other voices that allow for that change to happen, to disrupt the kind of subtle expressions of exclusion that we see as expressed in the Mission Ranch neighborhood and the design regulations that are embodied therein, and to promote and protect landscapes of difference that I see as a set of precious rights that are fast receding alongside suburbanization. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Professor Lung-Amam. That was very, very insightful. It looks like we have a good number or a few questions piling up in the chat. So the first one I can address, Lynn's asking if the presentation will be shared. I'm guessing you're referring to the slides because this whole presentation is being recorded and you will be able to access that. But Professor, would you be able to make your slides available for people that attended? Looks like a yes.
Yes.
And then, awesome, that's great. Someone is curious to know what the ethnic makeup of the Fremont City Council was and is, if you have that available.
Yeah, so at the time that I was doing my research, which was the late 2000s, early 2010, it was majority white. It was majority, the majority of folks who were white on the city council were longtime Fremont residents. There were quite a few, the remaining residents on the city council were largely Asian, but if I don't think I shared the ethnic background of all the different groups that were in Fremont, but there's a vast difference between, Asian, Taiwanese, Chinese, Indian Americans, Vietnamese, Cambodians. So there was I think 2 Chinese members of the city council, one who was an immigrant and one who was non-immigrants, and that really mattered in terms of how folks thought about issues of representation. So it was majority white. There were some Asian representation, but it was sort of across the spectrum of Asian America. And I talk about in the book sort of the distinctions amongst Asian immigrants and the ways in which they tended to think about these issues, and Asian Americans who were born in the US. And so that diversity didn't accurately represent the diversity of who is a part of Fremont. Though I do understand that Fremont City Council has changed quite a bit since I was there, and I believe they have elected their first Asian American mayor.
Great. It looks like I'm seeing another question from actually our esteemed chair of Livable Sunnyvale. Richard is asking about Livable Sunnyvale so we have an initiative to legalize missing middle housing, duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes in single family neighborhoods. One of the arguments that we've heard that has resonated most is providing flexibility for intergenerational living. And it seems that in many ways, these so-called McMansions, like Dan's, are filling a similar role. How do you see missing middle housing fitting in with the right to suburbia?
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to say in my presentation about McMansions that this is the kind of development that should be built everywhere. What I am trying to say about McMansions is that the critiques of them don't match actually the nuance of who lives in these homes and why, right? And so if we're going to have a discussion about regulation and planning, we need to be sensitive to the different kinds of configuration of housing that is needed for different families, that is desired by different families, and also understand the kind of politics that go into norming particular types of homes and particular types of, and protecting particular types of neighborhood from change. So missing middle housing is really well needed in suburbia. A lot of my research is actually on affordable housing. And so this clearly McMansionization is not the model of affordable housing. And missing middle housing is in many communities, including the community of Mission Ranch, is zoned out, right? And so we do need to change our zoning and make it more inclusive. I've been very happy to see many of the conversations about banning single family zoning, and in places that I live, making more space for duplexes, triplexes, and other kinds of homes that have generally been zoned out of suburban communities, and making a place for them. And alongside that will come more ethnic and class diversity in suburbia. And these contests around the forms and configurations of the houses will become more and more the norm, but will create a new norm that will be more inclusive when we start to take a real close look at these regulations that are stopping a lot of those things from currently being built.
That's, yeah. Thanks for the answer. And we have another question. There's a whole lot of them coming in. One from Neil about, and I think this kind of ties into what you've just talked about, but talking about reconciling this desire to redefine suburbia for wealthier immigrants alongside our need to also densify suburbs and desegregate them by income and non-Asian POC, people of color. So I think you touched on this with your, talking about our need to reform what we're doing with our zoning. Is there anything that you want to add on to that, or do you want to just let that stand?
So I pretty much stand where I stand, which is that I do think we need to reform our zoning. Certainly California is leading some of the conversations around this with regard to transit-oriented development and and densifying near transit. I should mention, though, that one of the Asian malls that I showed, one of the reasons why the city council was so concerned about the building of that mall there was that it was near transit. And the city council was concerned that with the configuration of ownership of that new mall, that they wouldn't be able to get their hands on all the owners to be able to densify that mall, and that area around transit when they wanted to. So one of the impetuses for the condo regulations that were adopted around Asian malls was this desire to be able to neatly and easily redevelop around transit in order to densify. And so what I'm saying here is that it's a complicated mix, right? Just like the idea of densifying around transit, one of the reasons that you have so many affordable housing advocates on the other side is saying if we're not putting in place the protections for the people who need that housing, then we're not actually doing anything but giving away more to developers. And in that same way, I think we need to be sensitive to the kinds of new development forms that are coming along the pike and how that makes room for some of the goals and diversity that we're looking for out of densifying, and that we need to also take a close look at those things as well. So it's not just density equals diversity, or density equals inclusion, or density equals affordability. It's actually a lot of intentionality that goes around that.
Another question from Agnes is around form-based codes. So do you feel form-based housing is in contrast to allowing suburban homeowners to make them represent their individual culture? So I think that question, and then how you feel about form-based codes on the whole.
Yeah, I don't think most new urbanists are a fan of my work, because I do actually think that we've gone a little bit too far in terms of form-based codes of saying that communities need to look like this, without, again, thinking about sort of the values that underlie them, right? So if you look at most new urbanist communities, and you see this in the scholarly literature, these are not diverse and inclusive communities. Many times they are, in some communities, they are gentrifying other communities in order to put in new urbanist communities with form-based codes that have sort of the idea of that these homes will result in more diverse communities, but you're knocking down an existing diverse community in order to replace it with these new form-based code. So again, these formulas don't tend to always work out like people suggest that they will, in part because, you know, a lot of new urbanist communities have set kind of the white middle class as the norm, right? And are not making space for multi-generational homes. They're not sort of taking as their premise kind of diverse ways of living and occupying homes. They're simply saying, you know, we want a diverse mix of housing. Well, diverse mix of housing doesn't always lead to a diverse mix of people and doesn't always lead to an inclusive environment. So yes, form-based codes can be good in some circumstances, just like missing middle housing can be good in some circumstances, but it's certainly not enough.
That makes a lot of sense. Just a reminder to everyone that if you have any more questions, feel free to throw them into chat. I have one of my own, actually. So I actually checked this morning, and so the Zillow, I checked on Zillow, and the median, according to them, the median price is like 1.8 million in Sunnyvale. I think I've seen other estimates around 1.5. Either way, it's a lot. So I'm kind of curious as to how you see, you know, our housing crisis, our affordability crisis impacting the ability of suburbs to provide a space for immigrants. Do you think schools will provide a compelling enough draw that, you know, they'll continue to find workarounds, or is this cost of entry going to be eventually too high and suburbs are not going to be the place for immigrants that they have been in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think the affordability crisis hurts everybody. You know, I am talking here in the book more generally, middle income or upper income immigrants, though certainly not immigrants who sort of meet the kind of stereotypes that proliferate across the valley about people coming to the valley with suitcases of cash that they just throw at a house and buy in all cash. And so there's various kinds of stereotypes that center around the Asian American experience and that make it seem like it's easy for Asian Americans to move into neighborhoods like the Mission Ranch neighborhoods. Most people who I talked to, like Dan, had struggled quite a bit in order to, although certainly not as much as Black and Latinx and many South Asian communities, to be able to afford these neighborhoods. Some of them rented, some of them lived with multiple family members in order to be able to afford these homes, and lived in multi-generational homes in order to be able to make ends meet. So these communities are, obviously threatened by a high living cost as well. But I should also mention that the Mission San Jose neighborhood also has almost no affordable housing in the neighborhood. And so, and many of the neighbors have fought vigorously, including many Asian American neighbors, against any inclusion of affordable housing in the neighborhood. And those are the kind of spaces that would not only make room for them to be able to stay in the neighborhood as they age out of their homes and maybe no longer have kids in the neighborhoods, but would make the neighborhood more vibrant and viable over the long term as well. So yes, the affordable housing crisis sucks, and we need a lot more interventions in order to make an inclusive environment, not only for Asian immigrants, Asian Americans, but for everybody.
I think you've made yourself, well, not that you weren't already very popular with everyone that's on this call. I don't think you'll find anyone that disagrees with that. That is very true. So another question from Sydney in the chat about the process of writing Trespassers. So is there anything that really surprised you in the process of interviewing and doing research for Trespassers? Or have you heard from readers living in different regions of the US that saw parallels in their experiences?
To the latter question, yes, I have actually, and it's been quite fulfilling to hear from students that have gone to Mission San Jose High, to hear from people who grew up in Fremont, to hear from people, from Asian Americans across the spectrum, that they've never seen themselves represented in literature in quite that way. There is a particular dearth of academic literature, but literature more generally on the Asian American experience. And so I think I get a fair share, I wouldn't say call it fan mail, but it is just people to say thank you for representing my experience, because that matters. And we don't often get to talk about, Tiger Moms or boba, culture, or the things that happen inside a predominantly Asian American community that are just not reflected elsewhere. And as to the process of writing, I am a scholar that cares deeply about issues of inequality, so it was not my intention actually to be writing a story about a upper middle income, relatively exclusive community in Silicon Valley. But I found the stories, I feel like we talk a lot when we're talking about inequality, about the communities who are most marginalized and disadvantaged. We do not talk a lot about the communities that are most advantaged, and where privilege lies, and how inequalities occur even in those environments. And so actually, I wrote Trespassers as a sort of challenge to myself to understand an environment that I didn't understand, and experience even as an Asian American, that I really knew very little about. And so in that way, it was a very fulfilling experience for me. And in terms of things that surprised me, I was surprised by the candor, actually, that a lot of people showed in terms of you ask them a question of what do you think about McMansions, and people didn't hold back on either side, and invited me into their homes to tell me exactly why they thought what they thought, including, all the way from homeowners on up to the mayor. And so I was surprised by, if you ask, how people will tell, but also because these are such polarizing issues, and such politicized issues like schools and homes. You couldn't get any more important in people's lives than that.
Yeah, I was really struck by that when I was reading your book, because there really is, in the Mission, and around Mission San Jose, the schools and home McMansions, there really is a lot of economic privilege that you see in these families where they have the money, they can afford to do these renovations. But when it comes to the planning commission and navigating city council meetings, where they're unable to rally people, they're not sure how to navigate the public process, where they're not as familiar with the social systems that are in place. I think that's a really interesting dichotomy where they have a lot of power in one arena, but not so much in the other. So yeah, super enlightening read. Anyone that hasn't read the book yet, I highly recommend, because there's lots of great nuggets in there. A quick question from Richard about Asian malls. Have you seen versions of the Asian mall in suburbia that follow a different form than the strip mall? So e.g. as village centers. So I'm guessing something like, as a downtown, or, just a different format of the Asian mall.
Yeah, certainly I have. I actually have an article about this, and where I trace across Silicon Valley the different forms of Asian malls that sort of reflects the different sort of trajectory of Asian Americans across class, and across different patterns of suburbanization. And so what it shows is sort of, a more organic Asian mall that might have changed from a traditional white shopping center to what you might call like a super center, an Asian mall super center, that reflects, more transnational investments that are happening in even more ex-urban communities than just than Fremont. And so there has been an evolution of the Asian mall that really reflects the kind of different class and ethnic composition, and also the kind of kids are living. And so absolutely, if you want a village center version, go to Cupertino.
And in the chat, I'm seeing a lot of thank yous, a lot of people saying that they are appreciative of your time. Richard says that he would love to read that article. So if you have a link, or know the good way for us to access it, I think we'd all be interested in reading that. And yeah, and some comments from people around, McMansions, and they don't believe that they should be allowed. Lots of different perspectives coming out in the chat.
It's certainly an issue that draws people on both sides. I am, just for the sake of clarifying, I am not arguing for or against McMansions. What I am arguing against is the kind of stereotypes that people tend to associate with these homes as an argument against them, without understanding or nuancing the kind of arguments. And I'm arguing for it as a kind of way and a lens into more broadly diversifying our understanding of the ways in which planning and design regulations are adopted and norm certain things, and exclude other kinds of forms and norms that are embedded in those.
Yeah, I think that's a great clarification. Galen arguing against bad faith arguments, kind of clearing up these misconceptions that people have. So it is 1:30, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So again, huge thank you to Professor Willow Lung-Amam for coming to speak with us today. I personally learned a lot. I think it was really interesting to think about this intersectionality of, the different privileges that we have, both economic, socially, and so on. So thank you for your time.
and the chat is still going. People are having a lot of fun typing.
And I want to say thank you as well, Professor. We appreciate having you here so much.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely. And I dropped the link for the Affordable Housing Month events in chat. Please take a look, and the recording of this talk will be posted on our Facebook page. Thank you one more time to Professor Willow Lung-Amam for joining us. And our next general meeting, if folks are interested, is the first Wednesday of the month, which I believe will be June 2nd. And if you are interested in joining Livable Sunnyvale, Julia, do you have the link to the membership form? Let me just see if I can drop that in, if I can find that myself, actually. And, here we go. Thank you. Thank you, Julia. So if you're interested in taking part in further Livable Sunnyvale meetings or events, or in joining our mailing list, please go ahead, fill out our membership form. And like I said, next meeting will be June 2nd, 6:30 p.m. Pacific time. Thank you one more time, Professor Lung-Amam, and I hope everyone has a lovely rest of your day.